He noticed a detail on her shoes, and that changed everything. Jonathan Blake had never followed anyone in his life. Until that morning. It wasn't a decision. It was the reflex of a man who had spent 20 years noticing what doesn't fit, and that didn't fit. The sneakers were worn out, the right sole peeling off, white in some previous life, and they belonged to an employee walking out through the service corridor with the posture of someone who doesn't owe anything to anyone. She turned the corner. He turned after her. The problem with following someone down a street you don't know is that it becomes obvious to anyone paying even the slightest attention. Jonathan figured that out in the first 2 minutes. He walked with the posture of someone used to walking into rooms where everyone already knows his name. He tried to relax his shoulders. It got worse. His phone rang. "Marcus?" He answered on the second ring, voice completely normal. "Mr. Blake, you got out of the car 11 minutes ago and still haven't come up. The security guard said you turned the corner on foot. Is everything okay?" "I'm walking." Silence on the other end. "Walking. That's right." "You walk now?" "Marcus." "Yes, sir?" "The 8:30 meeting. Let them know I'll start 10 minutes late." "May I ask?" "No." He hung up. Emily didn't quicken her pace, didn't look back, didn't give any sign that she knew she was being followed. She crossed 2 avenues, went down 3 blocks, turned onto a narrower street where the buildings got smaller and the trees got bigger. And Jonathan began to realize he was in a part of Manhattan he knew on a map, but had never actually set foot in. His phone vibrated. He ignored it. The neighborhood wasn't what he expected. It wasn't run down. It was alive, in a different way, but undeniably alive. A bakery with a handwritten sign, a flower stand on the sidewalk, a man about 70 years old sweeping the front of a small grocery store, whistling something Jonathan didn't recognize. Emily waved to him as she passed. The man raised his broom without stopping his whistling. "Good morning, Robert." "Good morning, dear. Did you bring the cake today?" "Tomorrow." "You say that every week." "And every week it's true." She didn't stop walking. "Thursday, I promise. Last Thursday you also promised. This Thursday is different." The man laughed to himself and went back to sweeping. Jonathan watched that exchange for a second longer than he should have, then kept walking, trying to look like he wasn't paying attention to absolutely anything. A boy about 8 years old came running out of a doorway and almost collided with him. "Sorry, mister," the boy shouted without stopping. "No problem," Jonathan answered, a second too late to no one. He turned the corner and stopped. Halfway down the block there was a renovated warehouse. Door open, a simple sign at the entrance. Community center. Open to all. Children were leaving carrying backpacks. An older woman was walking in with a bag of groceries. And Emily Parker, in worn sneakers and a work uniform, was standing at the entrance, greeting each person by name. Not with the professional kindness of someone trained to do so, but with the naturalness of someone who had grown up doing it. "Miss Clara, has Mr. Peterson arrived yet?" she asked the woman with the bags. "He got here early today. He's inside complaining about the chairs again. The chairs are perfectly fine." "For you." "He's 81 years old, Emily. He's 81 years old with the back of a 40-year-old. I've seen him go up those stairs." The woman laughed and went inside. On the outer wall of the warehouse there was a hand-painted mural. Houses, faces, open hands. Jonathan read the address in the corner without understanding why he read it. He stored it away, without knowing he was storing it. His phone vibrated for the 3rd time. A text message from Marcus. "Mr. Blake, the meeting has started. Are you okay? Should I call someone?" That was when Emily stopped moving. She stood still in the middle of the sidewalk, with her back to him. For 1 full second, like someone still deciding whether to bother. Then she turned around. She looked directly at him with the expression of someone who had known exactly what was happening for at least 2 blocks. And had decided to let him reach the end on his own, just to see how it would turn out. "Can I help you with something, Mr. Blake?" Jonathan Blake had survived $100 million negotiations without breaking a sweat. He had fired 3 executives on the same afternoon and had lunch afterward. He had looked furious investors in the eye and waited, in silence, until they gave in first. None of that had been as difficult as answering a janitor's question on the sidewalk of a neighborhood he barely knew. "I was passing through." Emily looked at him, then looked at the street, then looked at him again. With the patience of someone who had just heard the most creative answer to a simple question, and was deciding whether it was worth commenting on. Passing through. That's right. On this street. Yes, 6 blocks from your property. I like to walk. She nodded slowly once, with the expression of someone who had filed that information in a folder called Things That Make No Sense Whatsoever, and moved on. Good morning, Mr. Blake. She turned her back and went inside the community center. Jonathan stood on the sidewalk for 4 full seconds. Then he picked up his phone and called Marcus. Cancel the delay. I'm on my way. Are you okay? I'm fine. You sound like you're walking fast. I'm walking at a normal pace. I can hear your shoes hitting the ground. It's the same sound as when you lose a negotiation. Jonathan hung up. The next day at 8:20 in the morning, Jonathan entered the Upper East Side property with the day's agenda in his head, coffee in hand, and the absolute intention of not thinking about worn-out sneakers. It lasted until the East Corridor. Emily was there, mopping the floor with the concentration of someone solving a math problem. He slowed his pace without realizing it. Good morning, he said. Good morning, Mr. Blake. Silence. The mop kept moving. Jonathan stood still for a second longer than necessary, which, for him, was quite a lot. How long have you worked here? 2 years. And before that, another place. What kind of place? One where I also worked. He blinked. Right. And do you live nearby? Emily wrung the mop over the bucket with the precision of someone who had done it 15,000 times. I live where I live, Mr. Blake. That's not an answer. It's a complete answer. She started mopping again. It's just not the one you wanted. Jonathan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Do you always answer like that? I answer what was asked. I asked where you live. And I told you. She looked at him with complete courtesy, as if explaining something to a well-meaning but slightly slow child. If you'd like, you can check my contract. He hadn't read her contract. He had never read the contract of any cleaning staff member. That fact, at that specific moment, felt like a character flaw. That's not what Mr. Blake, with all due respect, if you stay standing here, I'm going to need to ask you to take a step to the right. I still have that section to do. He stepped to the right. She mopped exactly where he had been standing. Marcus was waiting in the office with the day's agenda printed in 2 copies, a cup of coffee at the exact right temperature, and the expression of someone who had questions, but had learned over 3 years that asking questions before 9 in the morning had consequences. Jonathan walked in, tossed his coat on the chair, stood in the middle of the room. Marcus, sir? If someone answers a question with the question you asked, what does that mean? Marcus considered carefully. It means the person doesn't want to answer, or that they don't owe anyone an explanation. That too. Which one is more likely? Depends on who the person is. An employee. From cleaning? Jonathan looked at him. Why did you go straight to cleaning? Because you walked in on foot again this morning and your shoes are making the same noise as yesterday. Marcus placed the coffee cup on the desk with the care of someone who knows they are at the limit of what they can say. Just a guess. Jonathan picked up the coffee, sat down, stared at the wall in front of him. The wall had nothing special about it. It was white, had an abstract art piece he had bought in 2018 because the architect said it worked in the space, and a window on the right with a view of the park. He stared at it anyway. Marcus, on the other side of the desk, waited. 10 seconds. 20. 30. At 38 seconds, he quietly picked up his phone and started timing. At 41 seconds, Jonathan said, She didn't answer any of my questions. None? She answered, but she didn't answer. Marcus put his phone back in his pocket. May I ask what you wanted to know? Who she is. We have her file in the HR system. I can pull it up in 2 minutes. That's not it. Marcus waited. It's what she does outside of here. A pause. That's not in the HR file. I know it's not in the HR file, Marcus. Just confirming. Jonathan stared at the wall for 3 more seconds. Then he stood up, went to the window, looked down at the park below with his hands in his pockets. There was a small crack in the system. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an operational problem. It was simply a piece that didn't fit into any category he had. And that specifically, was the kind of thing that stayed with you. I want the community impact records from the last 5 years. Marcus wrote it down without blinking. From which property? From all of them. A longer pause this time. All 340 properties, the entire portfolio. That's going to take legal a few days to compile. Then have them start today. Marcus wrote it down, stood up, walked to the door, and stopped with his hand on the knob. Mr. Blake. Both copies of today's agenda are still on the table. I know. You haven't looked at them. I know that too. Marcus left without saying another word, which was, coincidentally, the smartest decision he had made all week. That afternoon, Emily left through the same side gate as always, turned the same corner as always, and headed down toward the neighborhood in the same worn sneakers as always. At a corner, before entering the community center, she stopped. An elderly woman was sitting on a wooden bench in front of a narrow townhouse, with a cup of tea in her hands, and the look of someone who is in no hurry and never has been. Dorothy. Emily waved. Emily. The woman lifted her cup. You're walking faster than usual today. I had a long day. Every day of yours is long. This one was different. Dorothy took a sip of tea and didn't ask anything. Emily stood still for a moment, as if she was going to say something more. Then she just waved again and went through the gate of the community center. Dorothy watched the path she had taken and took another sip. In the Upper East Side office, at 6:40 in the evening, a thick envelope was delivered to Jonathan Blake's desk. Community Impact Records, Blake Holdings Portfolio, last 5 years. 112 pages. He had requested it at 2 in the afternoon. Legal had worked 4 straight hours to compile it. Jonathan stared at the envelope for a long moment, then he placed his hand on it and didn't open it. The envelope stayed on the desk from 6:40 in the evening until 12:11 at night. Jonathan didn't have the habit of leaving anything unresolved. He had the opposite habit, resolving everything before leaving the office, before sleeping, before any detail grew large enough to bother him. He was the kind of man who answered emails at 11 at night, not out of obsession, but because the alternative was knowing there was an unanswered email out there. The envelope stayed there anyway. At 12:11, he opened it. 112 pages. He read the first 30 standing up beside the desk. Then he sat down, then he stood up again, because sitting felt wrong for what he was reading. 3 Blake Holdings development projects over the last 5 years had directly affected the same stretch of the city. Old buildings demolished, families relocated with settlements within what the law required, within the minimum the law required. Infrastructure that had taken decades to build, small businesses, support networks, neighborhood relationships, had simply ceased to exist. Because the land was worth more without it. All legal, all documented, all absolutely within the parameters he himself had approved without reading beyond the numbers. And the neighborhood that Emily walked through every morning, in worn sneakers, in the uniform of someone who went to work at the building of the man who had demolished all of that, was on the map. Right there. In the middle of the 3 projects, like an interval between parentheses that someone had forgotten to close. Jonathan stood in front of the window for a length of time he didn't measure. Then he called the finance department. The phone rang 8 times before someone answered with the voice of a person who had just been pulled from sleep. I need to open a separate holding company. Simple structure, no direct connection to Blake Holdings. Tomorrow morning. If... Mr. Blake, it's almost 1 in the morning. I know what time it is. We can. Can I do that on Monday? Today is Thursday. Monday is too far away. Mr. Blake, with all due respect, it's almost 1 in the morning on a Thursday. Then you have the whole weekend. Silence on the other end. The kind of silence from someone calculating whether the salary is worth it. I'll see what I can do for Monday morning, sir. Great. Jonathan hung up, looked at the ceiling for 3 seconds and added, to no one, thank you. The next morning, Emily left through the service side door, turned the corner, and walked the usual 6 blocks. Something was different. She stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, looked both ways, and tried to identify what it was. The bakery was open. Robert was sweeping the front of the grocery store. The trees were in the same places as always. Then she saw it. The hole in the sidewalk in front of the community center, the one that had been there for 8 months, deep enough to bother anyone not paying attention, had been filled in. Fresh asphalt, still dark. Emily stared at it for a long moment. They fixed it, said Robert without stopping his sweeping. When? Yesterday afternoon. 2 people came, did the job in 40 minutes and left. Who called them? I don't know, the city, I imagine. Emily looked at the new asphalt one more time. The city had ignored that hole for 8 months. She had called 3 times, filled out 2 online forms, received 2 automated emails saying the request was under review. She said. She went into the community center without drawing any conclusions. That night at 10:40, Jonathan left his building on the Upper East Side wearing clothes he had specifically chosen not to draw attention. Dark pants, simple, understated, gray jacket, no visible logo. Marcus was in the building lobby by coincidence. He had forgotten his phone charger and watched his boss walk through the revolving door with the expression of someone processing information in very slow motion. "Mr. Blake." Jonathan stopped, turned around. "Marcus, what are you doing here at this hour?" "I forgot my charger." Marcus held up the item in his hand. "Are you going out?" "I am." "Dressed like that? What's wrong with these clothes?" Marcus chose his words with the care of a man crossing thin ice. "Your pants cost $2,300. I know because I processed the invoice. They're dark gray. They're handmade in Milan. You can tell from half a block away. I'm going for a walk, Marcus. At night, I like to walk. You said that yesterday, too, and the day before." Jonathan pushed open the revolving door. "Good night, Marcus." "Mr. Blake, if you'd like, I can." The door had already turned. Marcus stood in the lobby for about 10 seconds. Then he sent a text to his boss's phone. "If you need anything, I'm available." The reply came 40 seconds later. "Go to sleep." Marcus put his phone away, looked at the charger in his hand, and thought that he probably should indeed go to sleep. The neighborhood at night was different. Quieter, but not silent. A lit window here, a television there, the smell of something being cooked on some floor of some building. Jonathan walked slowly, hands in his pockets. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't cataloging problems. He was just looking. He stopped in front of the community center. At night, without the daytime activity, the mural on the outer wall was more visible. Jonathan stared at it for a while. The houses, the faces, the open hands. Then he lowered his gaze to the lower right corner. The address. Halsted Street, 412, District 6. He took out his phone and searched. The result came up in under 3 seconds. Halsted Street, 412, demolished in 2021. Blake Holdings Residential Development Project. Jonathan stood still. The wind moved something down the block. "Beautiful mural." The voice came from the porch of the narrow townhouse across the street. Dorothy was sitting there with a cup in her hands, as if it were completely normal to be on a porch at 11 at night. Jonathan looked at her. "It is. They painted it after they tore down the building that used to be there." Dorothy gestured vaguely toward the mural with her cup. "So people wouldn't forget what was there before." Jonathan didn't respond. "Did you have coffee today?" she asked. He blinked. "Good." She took a sip of whatever was in her cup. Cold coffee is the saddest thing in the world, worse than regret. Jonathan stared at her for a moment, not quite understanding what had just happened in that last exchange. "Good night," he said. "Good night." Dorothy looked down at her cup. "Watch out on the sidewalk over there. There's a hole. They fixed it today." She raised her eyes to him with a look that lasted a second longer than necessary. "They fixed it," she repeated, calmly. "How convenient." Jonathan walked on without realizing he should have stopped at that sentence. The next morning, Emily arrived at the community center and found Carol, the volunteer coordinator, at the entrance, holding an envelope with the expression of someone who didn't quite know how to feel. "This came for us early this morning." Carol held out the envelope. Emily opened it. A single sheet of paper, formal language, dry, direct. Approval of funds for structural roof renovation, installation of heating for winter, and renovation of the accessible restroom. Total amount $87,000. Signed by Halsted Community Investment Fund Limited Liability Company. Emily read the name 3 times. "Do you know this company?" Carol asked. Emily looked at the paper, then at Carol, then at the paper again. "No, and that no." Sounded less like an answer, and more like the beginning of a question she hadn't yet put into words. Diana Holt had organized 322 corporate events over 18 years at Blake Holdings. She knew exactly how each one ended. This one would be different. She had planned for it to be. The investor relations event happened every year in the same ballroom of the same hotel in Midtown. 40 tables, lighting that cost more than the catering, and 200 people who knew the exact value of their own handshake. Jonathan hated that evening with the consistency of someone who has hated something for so long. It had become part of the routine, like taxes and the dentist. But he showed up, every year. because it was the kind of thing a chief executive officer showed up for. This time, he arrived 6 minutes earlier than necessary, which, for Marcus, was signal enough that something was different. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, walking beside him through the entrance. "I'm fine. You arrived early. 6 minutes isn't early. For you, it's 45 minutes early." Jonathan grabbed a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and entered the ballroom with the posture of someone completely in control of everything. Marcus stayed 2 steps behind with the expression of someone who knows he isn't. The first hour was exactly what it always was. Handshakes, conversations about the market, someone trying to convince him of a project in Miami he didn't want to hear about. Someone trying to convince him of a project in Dallas he also didn't want to hear about. The food was good. He ate 3 forkfuls and set the plate down, because he could never eat at events. Another detail Marcus had mentally documented over the years without ever mentioning it. It was during the cocktail hour that Diana appeared beside him. Smile in place, champagne in hand, the kind of posture that took years to learn and looked natural once it was ready. Jonathan. She used his first name, which she did when she wanted it to sound casual. "What a beautiful event this year." "Diana. Are you okay? You seem distant." "I'm present." "True." She looked around the room. "More present than usual, actually. I noticed you've been visiting the Upper East Side property quite a bit lately." Jonathan took a sip of his water. "It's my property." "Of course." A calculated pause. "I just found the frequency interesting. Especially considering that your visits used to last an hour, and lately they've been lasting twice that. Operational efficiency." Diana swirled her champagne slightly in the glass. "Someone mentioned you've been having quite long conversations in the 3rd-floor hallway." Jonathan didn't respond. "With the cleaning staff," she added, with the tone of someone reading a footnote. "I know the employees at my properties. All of them?" "The relevant ones." Diana smiled. The kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, because it had no intention of doing so. "Of course." She lightly touched his arm, the social touch of someone saying goodbye. "Enjoy your evening, Jonathan." She crossed the ballroom toward the small stage where the microphone was still being adjusted. Jonathan watched her walk away. Marcus appeared beside him out of nowhere, as he had the habit of doing at bad moments. "She has the look of someone with a plan." Marcus said under his breath, "I know. Should I do something? Stay close. Close to you or close to her?" "To me. So I have someone to blame if things go wrong." Marcus blinked. "That's not how blame works, sir." Marcus, "Yes, stay close." The microphone squealed once, the universal signal that someone was about to speak when no one had asked for it. Diana Holt stepped up the 2 small stage steps with the naturalness of someone who had rehearsed the ascent. She clapped twice to get attention, and the ballroom gradually went quiet at the speed of 200 people who would have preferred to keep talking but knew they shouldn't. "Good evening, everyone." Clear voice projected the exact volume to sound spontaneous and still reach the back of the room. "I'd like to take a moment to share something I think everyone here will find interesting." Jonathan felt his stomach drop 2 inches. As some of you may already know, Jonathan has been showing a very personal interest in one of his properties on the Upper East Side. Diana paused for longer than was accidental, an interest that goes well beyond operational. Murmurs. The room woke up. "In fact, our chief executive officer has been dedicating considerable time to conversations with a member of the cleaning staff at the property." Another pause. A smile. Quite a special amount of attention for someone on the maintenance team. The silence that followed was the kind of silence 200 people make, when they are listening with complete attention but pretending they aren't. Marcus, beside Jonathan, said in a voice so low it almost didn't exist, "Sir, I don't fully understand what's happening, but my stomach is reacting very badly." "Mine too." "Is that a good sign or a bad one?" "Bad." "How bad?" "Marcus." "Yes." "Stop." Emily was near the service exit. She hadn't been invited to the event. She was there because the cleaning company had been hired for the setup of the space, and she had stayed later than necessary helping Carol organize the last details of the community center over the phone while she worked. When the ballroom filled with people in suits, she had stayed in a corner near the exit, waiting for the right moment to leave without crossing through the middle of the event. That moment had passed. Now there were 200 people and a microphone. She heard cleaning staff and special attention and felt that specific thing that happens when the floor disappears for a second beneath your feet. Not from shock, but from cold anger, the worst of the variations. She gripped the strap of her bag, right at the top. Jonathan set his glass of water on a nearby table and started walking. It wasn't a slow decision. There was no calculation of reputation, no analysis of consequences, no consideration of timing. It was the kind of movement that happens when the body decides before the brain has finished thinking. He crossed the ballroom. Marcus stayed where he was for 2 seconds, watching his boss walk away, then looked at Diana on the stage, then at the service exit, then back at his boss. What is he? He started to no one. Someone beside him, an investor from Boston he didn't know, finished the thought. I think he's going to her. Yes, Marcus agreed, still processing. He does that sometimes. Goes toward situations instead of, he stopped. Actually, he's never done this before. The investor from Boston raised an eyebrow. Marcus picked up the glass of water Jonathan had left behind and took a sip. Jonathan stopped beside Emily. He didn't say anything. No arm gesture, no hand on her shoulder, no look at the room with a defiant expression. He stood there, beside her, like someone who was simply where they decided to be. The room watched. Diana, on the stage, held her smile in place with visible effort. Emily looked at Jonathan. Jonathan looked straight ahead. 10 seconds. 15. Diana stepped down from the stage with the forced elegance of someone who wrapped up their speech earlier than planned. The conversation in the ballroom returned gradually, like a tide coming in. First a murmur here, then a laugh there, until the sound of 200 people returned to normal level, and the center of the ballroom stopped being an involuntary stage. Marcus, across the room, took another sip of Jonathan's water. Outside, the night was cold. Emily left through the side entrance before Jonathan could reach her, and when he came through the door, she was already standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed and an expression that wasn't tears and wasn't shouting. It was something more controlled and harder to deal with than either. Emily? No, her voice was steady, calm, which was worse. I want you to listen to me carefully, Mr. Blake. He stood still. You walked into that ballroom and stood beside me in front of 200 people. She didn't raise her voice. I know you thought you were defending me, but what you did was confirm everything she said. Now I'm not just the cleaning employee anymore. I'm the chief executive officer's charity project. Jonathan opened his mouth. You just turned me into your event's charity case. The wind passed between the two of them. Jonathan stared at her with the expression of someone who had done the right thing and the wrong thing at the same time, and was still discovering that both could be true simultaneously. Inside the ballroom, Marcus was still standing in the same spot, holding the empty glass. The investor from Boston walked past him again. How did it end out there? Marcus looked at the side door. I still don't know. Will it work out? Marcus thought for one honest second. Depends on what works out means for each of them. The investor from Boston nodded, as if that made complete sense, grabbed a fresh glass from the tray and walked away. Marcus kept looking at the door. Outside, Jonathan still hadn't come back, which, on Marcus's scale, could be very good or very bad, and that night, he honestly didn't know which one to hope for. Jonathan Blake had formulated the perfect response. It took him the entire night, 3 cups of coffee and a 40-minute walk around the apartment rooftop, but the response was ready. Clear, direct, irrefutable. The kind of explanation that resolves a misunderstanding with surgical efficiency. Emily came to work too early and he missed the window. He found her in the 4th-floor hallway at 8:40 in the morning. Broom in hand, hand at the top of the handle, right at the top, which he already knew what it meant. Emily, I need to explain what happened yesterday, she kept sweeping. I wasn't trying to expose you, I was trying to... I heard you, Mr. Blake. You didn't, because I haven't said it yet. You're going to say you were defending me. Jonathan opened his mouth. That you didn't mean to cause any embarrassment. He closed it. That it was an instinctive reaction, and that if you could, you would have done it differently. He stood still. Emily stopped sweeping. She looked at him with a patience that was worse than anger because it had no warmth in it at all. I heard you, Mr. Blake. And she left down the hallway. No sarcasm, no redirection. None of that millimeter of a smile at the corner of her mouth that he had learned to expect. She simply left, with the broom under her arm and the bag on her shoulder, turned the corner of the hallway and disappeared. Jonathan stood there. That was different. He knew her sarcasm. He had learned the rhythm, the timing, the exact moment she would turn a question upside down and hand it back to him. He knew that. He could find his footing within that. The silence was another country. Marcus was waiting at the elevator entrance with the day's agenda in his hands and an expression trying to be neutral, but failing. How did it go before he could stop himself? Badly. How badly? She left without being sarcastic. Marcus processed that for a second. Is that bad? It's terrible. Why is it terrible? Sarcasm isn't usually a positive thing. Hers is. Jonathan stepped into the elevator. When she's sarcastic, we're still talking. When she just walks away, you're not talking anymore. Exactly. The elevator closed. It rose. Marcus looked down at the day's agenda in his hands, as if the meetings scheduled for that morning were suddenly much less urgent than they had seemed. At 11 in the morning, Marcus entered the office with the careful step of someone who has an idea and doesn't know if he'll survive it. Mr. Blake. No, you haven't even heard it. When you walk in like that, the answer is no. I have a suggestion about the situation with Miss Parker. Jonathan looked up from the desk for the first time in an hour. Marcus took that as a green light. You need to act naturally. I act naturally. With all due respect, sir, you showed up at the event yesterday with 2 coffees as if that were a casual gesture, and the cup almost fell out of my hand. 2 coffees is completely normal. For whom, sir? Jonathan didn't answer. My point, Marcus continued, encouraged by his own theory, is that you need to stop trying and simply exist. Be a presence. No agenda, no strategic coffee, no showing up in the hallway at the exact time she's there. I don't show up at the exact time. Sir, I have the building's access records. You appear on the 3rd floor within an 8-minute window of her schedule every week for 3 weeks. Silence. That's operational coincidence. The access records don't use that expression, unfortunately. Jonathan closed the folder in front of him, opened it again, closed it. All right. How do I simply exist, Marcus? Marcus became very enthusiastic about the question, which was a warning sign Jonathan ignored. I've prepared some guidelines. You prepared guidelines, just 3. Simple. Marcus pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. First, don't start the conversation. Let her start it. She never starts conversations. Then you learn to exist in comfortable silence. I don't know how to do that. I know, that's why it's in the guidelines. Second, if she speaks, answer briefly. Don't elaborate. Don't offer coffee. Don't ask questions about the neighborhood, using phrases you learned from an article. Jonathan opened his mouth. Yes, I know about the article. I read the browser history when you asked me to clear the computer last week. Marcus didn't even blink. Third, show up, but show up doing something else. Don't show up for her. Show up for the space. Jonathan stared at the piece of paper for a long moment. This is the most complicated advice I've ever received about how to seem simple. It's harder than it looks, yes. Marcus, you're 32 years old and you've been single for how long? A pause. The guidelines are based on research, sir. Whose research? Various sources. What sources? Several. Marcus, about 3 television series and a podcast on nonviolent communication. Jonathan took the piece of paper, folded it, put it in his pocket. I'll take it into consideration. Is that the same as I won't use this but thank you? That's exactly what it is, yes. What Jonathan did in the days that followed was not follow Marcus's guidelines. It was simpler. And harder. At the same time. He stopped trying to fix what had happened at the event. Stopped showing up in the hallway with pretexts. Stopped formulating perfect responses on the rooftop at 2 in the morning. And he directed all that energy to the only place where he could do something concrete. The holding received authorization for the 2nd contribution, larger than the first. Kitchen renovation for the community center. New equipment for the job training workshops. A partnership with a community clinic 3 blocks up for free services on Fridays. All anonymous. All clean. All far from the Blake name. It was almost 10 at night when Emily closed the door of the community center. Carol had left an hour earlier. Mr. Peterson had complained about the chairs for 40 minutes, and then praised the coffee for 5, which was the normal ratio. The kids from the after-school group had left behind the usual chaos of crayons and half-full cups. Emily turned off the lights one by one. And in the silence of that empty space, she looked around. The kitchen with new equipment that had arrived on a Monday morning without being ordered. The windows with replaced seals. No one had complained about the cold that winter yet. The renovated roof that had stopped dripping in the back hallway after 3 years of dripping. The clinic that Carol had mentioned, with the expression of someone who didn't understand how they had managed it but didn't want to question it. Emily stood in the middle of the room with her keys in her hand. Something didn't add up. It wasn't gratitude. She knew how to receive gratitude, knew where it came from and why. It wasn't luck. She had learned too early that luck was a word people on the outside used to explain things they didn't want to examine too closely. It was something else. An account that didn't balance. A piece that had appeared without anyone asking for it, that fit perfectly. And that specifically was the problem. Because things that fit perfectly without explanation usually have an explanation that nobody gave you. She picked up her phone. She looked up the number for the Halstead Community Investment Fund. She had written it down the first time the envelope arrived because that was the kind of thing Emily Parker wrote down. It rang 3 times. Halstead Investment. Good evening. Good evening. My name is Emily Parker. I'm a volunteer coordinator at the District 6 Community Center. You made a contribution to our renovation a few weeks ago, and I'd like to know who is behind this holding company. A brief pause on the other end. I'm sorry, Miss Parker. That information is confidential by contract. Emily waited. I can't disclose the names of the investors. She waited 1 more second. That's all right. Thank you. She hung up. She stared at the renovated ceiling in the dark. The person on the other end had hesitated. Not much, less than 2 seconds. But they had hesitated, and Emily Parker had spent her entire life learning that the answers people give quickly are the ones they've practiced. And the ones where they hesitate are the ones that cost something to hold back. Someone knew who she was, and had chosen not to say. Emily Parker was not the kind of person who left an open account. She never had been. Since she was 17, when she learned that unanswered questions don't disappear. They just grow larger while you pretend they aren't there. So she answered the questions, all of them, one by one, until they were gone. The question this time had the name of a holding company and a 2-second hesitation. She started answering it the next morning. Carol. Emily walked into the community center with a cup of coffee and the expression of someone about to have a work conversation. But the kind of work conversation that requires coffee. Did you keep all the envelopes that came this year? Carol looked up from the pile of papers on the desk. I kept them. Why? I need to take a look. All of them? The ones that came without an identified sender. Carol opened the drawer under the desk, pulled out a thin folder and handed it over without asking anything more. Which was one of Carol's best qualities. She knew when Emily was in investigation mode. And interrupting investigation mode didn't end well for anyone. Emily sat in the chair in front of the desk, opened the folder and started reading. 3 envelopes. 3 different contributions. Identical formatting in all 3. Letterhead from Halstead Community Investment Fund, Limited Liability Company, registered in the state of Delaware, which Emily had already researched. Because Delaware was where you registered a company when you didn't want the name to show up easily. But there was one detail in all 3 documents that she hadn't noticed the first time. The holding company's tax identification number. She wrote it down, closed the folder, handed it back to Carol. Thank you. Did you find what you needed? Not yet. Emily picked up her cup. But I'm getting there. It took 2 days and a favor from a former colleague who worked at an accounting office downtown. Emily, this is a corporate record. It's not exactly confidential, but it's also not something you look up out of curiosity. It's not curiosity. What is it then? It's a question that needs an answer. A pause on the other end of the phone. Have you always been this way? Since I was 17. That must be exhausting. Sometimes. The identification number is this one. She read it aloud. Can I find out the parent company? Another pause. Longer. I can check the public records. But if there's more than one layer of holding company, I'll lose the trail. Check what you can. On Thursday morning, Emily arrived at the Upper East Side property with 2 new pieces of information, one question still open, and the firm intention of not saying anything until she was certain. Jonathan was in the 3rd floor hallway. Not with coffee, not with a pretext. He was standing near the window at the end with his phone in his hand, looking at the screen with the concentration of someone reading something they're not liking. Emily started working without commenting. Silence for about 2 minutes. which was, on their scale, almost a conversation. "Did you know that Delaware has more registered companies than it has residents?" she said, without looking up from the broom. Jonathan looked up from his phone. "I did. Interesting, isn't it? It's a characteristic of the American corporate registration system. It's a useful characteristic for anyone who doesn't want their name showing up easily." Jonathan stared at her for a second. "It's also useful for several legitimate purposes. Absolutely." Emily swept the corner of the hallway with complete calm. Holding companies that make anonymous investments in communities, for example. Very legitimate. There are various reasons for an investment to be anonymous. There are. She stopped. She looked at him for the first time since she'd entered the hallway. Guilt is one of them. Jonathan didn't look away. Responsibility is another. Emily looked at him for 3 full seconds. The kind of look that is neither hostile nor friendly, it's just evaluative. Like someone reading a sentence twice to make sure they understood it correctly. "There's a difference," she said. "I know there is. Guilt does what it needs to do to feel better. Responsibility does what needs to be done, regardless of how it feels. I know the difference, Emily." It was the first time he had used her name without her last name. Neither of them commented on it. The conversation had gone too far to be just professional, and both of them knew it. But there was a kind of unspoken agreement in place. Neither of them was going to name what was happening, because naming it would require deciding what to do with it, and neither of them was ready for that decision yet, so they stayed there. Jonathan leaning against the wall, Emily with the broom still in her hand, in the middle of the handle, not at the top. A silence that was not uncomfortable, the rare kind. The hallway door opened. "Excuse me." Dorothy walked in carrying a box, coat buttoned up to her neck, with the expression of someone who had just climbed 4 flights of stairs because the elevator was slow and had no regrets whatsoever. Emily blinked. "Dorothy, what are you doing here? Carol said you forgot your lunch at the community center yesterday." Dorothy placed the box on the hallway console. "I brought it." "You came all the way from the neighborhood to the Upper East Side to bring a meal?" "The subway is fast, and I needed some fresh air. It's very cold out there." "Fresh air is relative." Dorothy looked around the hallway with total calm, and then noticed Jonathan as if he had just materialized out of nowhere. "Oh, hello." Jonathan straightened up slightly. "Good afternoon. Do you live here?" "I'm the owner of the building." Dorothy considered that for a moment with the seriousness of someone evaluating an answer on a test. "And you were in the hallway doing what, exactly?" Jonathan opened his mouth. "An inspection," he said. "An inspection," Dorothy repeated with the same tone she would use for, "Of course you were." "Routine check." She looked at Emily, looked at Jonathan, looked at the space between the two of them with the attention of someone who reads situations the way other people read books. "Did you have coffee today?" she asked Jonathan. He blinked. "I did." "Good." She picked up the box again, took out a container with a lid, and handed it to Emily. "There's soup, too. It was cold last night. I figured you hadn't eaten properly." "I eat properly." "You eat enough to function. That's not the same thing." Dorothy adjusted her coat, checked the middle button that was crooked and fixed it. "I need to get back. Mr. Peterson will complain about the chairs without me there." "He complains with you there too." "Yes, but when I'm there, he complains more quietly." She waved to Jonathan with the ease of someone saying goodbye to a person she has known for years. "Take good care of the hallway." Dorothy left down the hallway with the same calm pace she had arrived with, went down the stairs without hurrying, and the door closed behind her with a soft click. The silence returned. Emily was looking at the soup with an expression that wasn't exactly emotion, but was right next to it. "Does she always do this?" Jonathan asked. "Always. Show up out of nowhere with food? Show up when I least expect it, and do exactly what I needed without asking if I needed it." Jonathan looked at the door through which Dorothy had left. "She asked if I'd had coffee. She always asks that." "What does it mean?" Emily finally smiled. Not the centimeter from before, a real smile. Small, but real. "I still don't know." She picked up the broom. "But when I figure it out, I'll let you know." That night, the reply from the accounting colleague came by text. 3 lines. "Got 1 layer. Halstead LLC is controlled by another holding company called Northeast Urban Partners. That second one has cleaner records. Majority partner, Blake Holdings Incorporated." Emily stood still with her phone in her hand in the middle of her apartment kitchen. Blake Holdings. The name stayed on the screen for a length of time she didn't measure. She had known. She had gotten too close over the last 2 days not to know. But knowing that you know and seeing it written down are completely different things. And now it was written down. Emily Parker slept well that night. That was the problem. She had discovered that the man who paid her salary was anonymously funding the work of her entire life, and she had slept 7 hours straight, woken up before the alarm, and had her 5:30 coffee with the same calm as always, which meant that some part of her already knew what she needed to do, and wasn't happy about it. She arrived at the property at 8 in the morning, did the work in the second-floor hallway, then the third, and then went to the building's administrative office and asked to speak with the operations manager. Patricia Chen was 53 years old, wore half-moon glasses, and had the specific patience of someone who has managed a luxury building for 18 years and has seen everything. Transfer? Patricia looked at Emily over her glasses. To where? Any property that has an opening. May I ask why? Personal reason. Emily, you're one of the best employees we have in this building. If there's some problem with a resident, there's no problem. With a colleague? No either. Then, personal reason, Patricia? Emily placed the completed form on the desk. I need an answer by Friday. Patricia looked at the form, looked at Emily, looked at the form again. You filled this out this morning? Last night. Before or after sleeping? Before. Patricia sighed, picked up the form and placed it in the pile of documents on the left, the pile of things that were going to be processed, not ignored. I'll see what I can do. Thank you. Emily stood up. Emily, she stopped in the doorway. Whatever the personal reason is. Patricia took off her glasses and cleaned them on the corner of her blouse. I hope it's worth it. Emily stood still for a moment. Me too, she said, and left. Jonathan found out at 2:40 in the afternoon. Patricia had sent an email to Blake Holdings' Human Resources Department, which had reached the operations coordinator, who had forwarded it to Marcus, following the staff movement protocol for premium properties. Marcus read it, read it again, stared at the screen for about 15 seconds. Then he went to Jonathan's office door and knocked twice. Come in, Jonathan said without looking up from the desk. Marcus walked in, closed the door, stood just inside with the tablet in his hand and the expression of someone who is about to deliver news and is still figuring out how. Mr. Blake. One moment. It's about Miss Parker. Jonathan looked up. Marcus turned the tablet and showed the screen. Transfer request. Date. Property of origin. Reason field. Personal. Emily Parker's signature at the bottom. The small and organized handwriting of someone who writes only what is necessary. Jonathan stared at the form for a length of time. Marcus didn't measure. This time it didn't seem appropriate. When did this arrive? 20 minutes ago. She asked for when. Response by Friday. Transfer immediate upon approval. Jonathan nodded once, slowly. Process it. Marcus blinked. With all due respect, sir. Are you sure? She requested a transfer. Process the request. I can check whether there's some operational issue that would justify keeping. Marcus. Yes, she requested a transfer. His voice was calm, completely calm, which was different from being okay. Process the request. Marcus left without another word. Jonathan sat at his desk for about 3 minutes doing absolutely nothing, which for him was the equivalent of a weather event. Then he stood up, went to the window. It was what he always did when he needed to decide something. The view of the park helped organize his thinking. He had learned that at 26, during a negotiation that had lasted 3 weeks and ended at that specific window. Looking at the trees until the right answer appeared with the clarity of something obvious. He kept looking. The trees were there. The park was there. The city kept existing with its usual indifference. The answer didn't come. He stood there anyway, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly dropped, which Marcus would have noticed immediately if he had been in the room. Because Jonathan Blake's shoulders didn't drop. Never. It was one of the constants of the universe, along with taxes and the third-floor elevator squeaking. But Marcus wasn't in the room. So he stayed like that for a length of time no clock was measuring. Marcus, on the other side of the door, was sitting at his own desk with the tablet on his lap and the day's agenda completely ignored. His assistant, Jennifer, walked past with a pile of documents and looked at him. Everything okay? I don't know. With Mr. Blake? I don't know that either. You have that look you get when he made the offer for the Seattle project and then went 3 days without speaking properly. It's worse than Seattle. Jennifer hugged the pile of documents with the wisdom of someone who knows when not to ask more. But she stopped 2 steps from the desk. May I offer an unsolicited opinion? Please. Sometimes people request a transfer because they need a reason for someone to tell them they shouldn't go. Marcus looked at her. And if the person says nothing? Jennifer considered. Then the person who stayed silent will have to learn to live with the sound of silence. She shrugged. But that's just an unsolicited opinion. She left with the documents. Marcus looked at Jonathan's office door for a long moment. Then he opened his drawer, took out a piece of paper, wrote an address and folded it in half. The 3rd-floor hallway was empty when Emily walked through it for the last time that afternoon. It was late. Most of the residents had gone out or were on the upper floors. The end of daylight came through the window at the end and made the wooden floor turn golden, in a way she had never paid attention to before. Or maybe she had and hadn't registered it. Which was a different thing. She swept slowly. In the hallway was the console where Jonathan had left the coffee on the first Thursday. The window where he would lean with his phone in his hand, pretending he was reading something. The exact spot on the floor where she had changed the light bulb, while he held the base of the small ladder without her having to ask. Emily stopped in the middle of the hallway. She waited, by a reflex she hadn't asked for the sound of footsteps at the end of the hallway. The presence that had become part of the routine without asking permission. Some slightly crooked line, some comment that seemed to be about one thing and was about another. Nothing. The hallway was empty and silent and golden, and that specific silence was exactly what she had chosen. She knew that. Even so, she stood still for about 10 more seconds before putting away the broom, picking up her bag, and walking out of the hallway for the last time. It was nearly 6 in the evening when Marcus knocked on Jonathan's office door again. Come in. Marcus entered. Jonathan was at the window still. Or again, it was hard to know. Without turning around, he said, was the request processed? It was. Is there a property available? There's one on 72nd Street. She starts Monday. Good. Marcus stood in the middle of the room for a moment. Then he walked to the desk, placed the folded piece of paper beside the keyboard, and left without saying anything. Jonathan stayed at the window for a while longer. Then he went to the desk, sat down, and saw the paper. Folded once. Plain paper. Marcus's handwriting. An address. Community Center, District 6. Halsted Street area of the neighborhood. Below, in smaller letters, Marcus had written, "This isn't a suggestion, it's just an address. You decide what to do with addresses." Jonathan stared at the paper for a long time. Outside, the park was dark. The paper had stayed on Jonathan's desk for the entire weekend. It wasn't that he had ignored it, it was that every time he walked near the desk, there was a perfectly valid reason not to pick it up. A phone call, a report, the coffee getting cold, gravity. On Monday morning, he woke up, made coffee, picked up the paper, and left. The neighborhood, on a cold Monday afternoon, with the low sky and half-empty sidewalks, had a quietness different from the movement he had seen before. Jonathan got out of the cab at the corner and started walking with his hands in his pockets, with the expression of someone who has a destination but is still negotiating with themselves whether they'll get there. Robert was sweeping the front of the grocery store with his usual consistency. "You again," Robert said, without stopping his sweeping. "Good afternoon. Getting to know the area?" Jonathan stopped. "How do you know I said that?" "I don't." Robert looked up with complete calm. "But everyone who comes here for the first time and isn't from here says they're getting to know the area." He went back to sweeping. "Was I right?" Jonathan stood still for a moment. "More or less. Progress." Robert pointed with the broom handle toward the community center in the middle of the block. "If you're looking for someone, Dorothy's out back." Jonathan hadn't mentioned Dorothy. "Thank you," he said, carefully. "No need." Robert swept another stretch. "But if you're going to talk to her, go with honesty. She can tell when people aren't being honest from the second floor." "Understood. And don't compliment the garden, thinking it'll help. She planted the left flower bed wrong, and she knows it, and doesn't want comments." Jonathan looked at Robert for a moment. "Is there anything else?" "No. You can go." Dorothy was sitting in the covered back area with a cup in her hands and the air of someone who had made that appointment with herself before anything else on her agenda. She saw him come in through the side entrance. She showed no surprise whatsoever. "Mr. Blake," she said, with the calm of someone who had been expecting this visit for a few days and had decided not to rush it. Jonathan stopped. "You remember me? I'm 82 years old, not amnesiac." She gestured to the chair on the other side of the table. "Sit down." He sat down with the care of someone not sure if the chair will hold, and Dorothy noticed, which was exactly the kind of thing Dorothy noticed. "That chair is 12 years old and has held people heavier than you," she said. "You can actually sit down." Jonathan settled in. "You went to the building to bring soup to Emily," he said. "I did. And now I'm here." "You are. Aren't you going to ask why?" Dorothy took a sip from her cup calmly. "I know why." Jonathan looked at her. "You know?" "A man who owns an entire building repeatedly shows up in the hallway where an employee works, stands beside her at a corporate event in front of 200 people, and then shows up in her neighborhood at 11 at night looking at a mural." Dorothy adjusted the cup in her hands. "It's not a mystery, Mr. Blake. It's a trajectory." Jonathan stayed quiet. "And now you're here," she continued, with that look of someone who has questions but isn't sure if they have the right to ask them. "I'm not sure I do. Honest." Dorothy looked at the garden ahead. "That's already more than most." They sat in silence for a moment. In the hall, one child was arguing with another about math with a conviction inversely proportional to the knowledge being demonstrated. "How is she?" Jonathan asked. Dorothy didn't answer right away. She turned the cup slightly in her hands, the gesture of someone weighing not the answer, but how much of the answer. "Whole," she said finally, "which is different from okay, but harder to build. She requested the transfer because of me. She requested the transfer because of herself." Dorothy looked at him directly. "There's a difference." "What difference?" "When it's because of someone else, we stay waiting for the other person to change something." Dorothy set the cup down on the table. "When it's because of yourself, you're trying to protect something you feel you're about to lose." Jonathan looked at the garden. "What is she trying to protect?" "Who she is." Dorothy said this with the simplicity of someone who doesn't need to elaborate because the sentence contains everything. Emily has spent her whole life building a foundation that doesn't depend on anyone. Every brick laid alone, every decision made alone, everything fixed with her own hands. She paused. When someone starts showing up on that foundation with good intentions, she doesn't see help. She sees the beginning of a debt. "I don't want her to owe me anything." "I know you don't." Dorothy picked up the cup again. But Emily's heart doesn't listen to intention. It listens to pattern, and the pattern of her life says that the good things that arrive without being asked for usually come with a price that shows up later. Jonathan didn't respond. One of the children in the hall let out a sudden laugh, the kind of child's laugh that has no context and doesn't need any. "She knows it was me. With the holding company," Jonathan said. "I know she knows. And she left anyway. Especially because of that." He closed his eyes for a second. "So what do I do?" Dorothy was silent for a moment that was a little longer than comfortable. "Did you have coffee today?" Jonathan blinked at the change. "I did, this morning." Dorothy looked at him, in that specific way of hers, direct at the same level, with no hurry at all. "So does she." Her voice was calm. "Every day at 5:30, before anything else." Jonathan stayed quiet. Before getting dressed, before checking her phone, before knowing how the day is going to go. Dorothy placed the cup on the table carefully. Because it's the only thing of the day that doesn't depend on anyone. That can't be taken away, changed, or complicated by any circumstance. It's hers, completely, the only moment when she doesn't owe anything to anyone. Jonathan stared at the garden without seeing the garden. There was a difference between knowing that a person was independent and understanding where that independence came from. He had known since the beginning, now he understood, and understanding cost more. "So what do I do?" he repeated, lower this time. Dorothy looked at him with a patience that wasn't indifference, it was the opposite. It was such complete attention that it didn't need to hurry. "Stop trying to fix things." She said it with complete simplicity. "You are very good at solving problems, Mr. Blake. You can see what's wrong, calculate what's missing, and put it in place." A pause. "But she's not a problem." And as long as you keep arriving with the mindset of someone who's going to resolve something, she's going to keep walking out the door. Jonathan stood still. So what do I do? You've asked that 3 times now. Because I still don't have the answer. I know. Dorothy stood up slowly, with the slowness of someone who has no hurry for anything. And the fact that you don't have a ready answer is the first good thing you've done since you started showing up around here. She picked up the cup and walked toward the center's door. Dorothy, Jonathan said. She stopped. Why are you telling me all this? Dorothy stood still for a moment with her back to him. Then she turned slightly, enough for him to see the side of her face. Because you came. She shrugged with the softness of someone saying something very simple that many people would never understand. You could have stayed at your office window looking at the park. But you came. A pause. That counts. And she went inside the community center without another word. Jonathan left the way he had come. Robert had finished sweeping and was rearranging the fruit at the entrance stand with the standards of someone who took that very seriously. So? Robert asked without looking up. She doesn't make it easy. She never makes it easy. Robert positioned an apple with surgical precision. That's what makes her who she is. Jonathan turned the corner and stopped. The mural was there as always. The houses, the faces, the open hands, and in the lower right corner, the address. Halsted Street, 412, District 6. He had read that before. Had looked it up, had stood in front of it at night, had thought he understood. He hadn't understood. Now he had just heard an 82-year-old woman describe a person who drank coffee at 5:30 because it was the only thing of the day that was completely hers. He had just sat in a 12-year-old chair in a narrow garden of a center that existed because someone had rebuilt what had been destroyed. Name by name, family by family, brick by brick. In the exact space between the 3 projects that Blake Holdings had demolished, without him having properly looked at the map. Jonathan stood in front of the mural for a length of time no clock was measuring. He looked at the address, at the community center, at the sidewalk he had repaired anonymously, at Robert's grocery store and the bakery with the handwritten sign, and the trees that nobody had planted recently. Because they were already there before everything, before the projects, before the demolitions, before him. And he understood truly this time the size of what Emily Parker had spent years rebuilding, on the margins of what he had destroyed without ever having stopped to ask what had been there before. His phone vibrated. Marcus. A message. 4 o'clock meeting waiting. Should I reschedule? Jonathan looked at the mural for one more moment. He typed, reschedule, and stayed there a little longer. The neighborhood meeting happened every last Thursday of the month in the community center hall, with chairs in rows, weak coffee, and at least one person who arrived late and pretended they hadn't. Emily was sitting in the 3rd row when the city representative started the presentation. We have a new partnership with the private sector. Blake Holdings has announced a change in its urban development policy. Starting this quarter, every new project will allocate 15% of its value to community infrastructure in the affected areas. He clicked to the next slide. Including this neighborhood. Emily stared at the slide. Beside her, Carol tilted her head. Did you know about this? No. I thought you knew everything that involved the holding company. I knew about some things. Looks like there's more. Looks like there is. Emily said, with the voice of someone processing in real time who would have preferred to be doing it in private. Marcus had shown up at the community center 3 days earlier with the excuse of checking on the progress of the renovations funded by the holding company, which was technically true and completely suspicious at the same time. Carol had offered coffee. Marcus had accepted. And then he had done what Marcus did when he was nervous, which was talk. It's a very serious project, he said, holding the cup with both hands. Mr. Blake personally reviewed every clause of the community contract. He spent weeks on it. He also spent a lot of time around here, actually, talking to people in the neighborhood, understanding the context, the history. Carol looked up. He came here personally? Marcus blinked. That's not. He adjusted the cup. It's a broad corporate policy. Not necessarily. You said around here. I said around there. In the general sense, through the urban context. You said around here, Carol repeated, with the patience of someone who works with children and knows how to recognize someone trying to undo what they said. Marcus took a sip of coffee that went on too long to be casual. "Can I see the renovation invoices?" Carol smiled. "Of course." She turned the computer around. "And you can keep the coffee. You're going to need it." After the meeting, Emily went to Dorothy's porch. She knocked on the door. Dorothy opened it as if she had been expecting her, because she probably had been. "Come in." Dorothy's living room had books on every available surface, an armchair that was clearly her favorite spot, and a smell of tea that seemed permanent. Emily sat on the sofa, Dorothy in the armchair. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "He was here," Emily said. "He was. You talked to him." "I did. And you didn't tell me. You didn't ask." Emily looked at her own hands. "What did you want to know?" "How you were." Emily stayed quiet for a second. "And what did you say?" "I said you were whole." Dorothy took a sip of tea. "And that whole is different from okay." The clock on the wall marked the silence. "Dorothy." Emily looked up. "Am I doing the right thing?" Dorothy slowly lowered her cup. "What do you think you're doing? Keeping my ground? Or pushing away someone who got too close to the ground?" Emily didn't answer. "There's a difference," Dorothy said gently. "Independence is not needing anyone to be who you are." A pause. "Isolation is not letting anyone get close enough to find out." Emily stared at the clock without seeing the clock. "What if I let someone in and lose who I am? Do you really think you're that fragile?" The question hung in the air for a while. Emily looked at Dorothy. Dorothy held her gaze with the calm of someone who already knows the answer and is waiting for the other person to get there. "No," Emily said, finally. Her voice came out differently, more direct, like someone answering a question about themselves truly, for the first time without redirecting. "I'm not." Dorothy picked up her cup of tea. "The 5:30 coffee is still yours, no matter who else is in the kitchen." Emily looked at her for a second. Then she stood up, picked up her bag, and headed toward the door. "Where are you going?" Dorothy asked. "To close an open account. Now, it's almost 8 at night." "I know." Emily opened the door. "But open accounts don't close on their own." Dorothy took the last sip from her cup. "No." Her lips formed something that was almost a smile. "They don't." Emily went to the Upper East Side residential building. Patricia Chen was just leaving when she arrived at the entrance. "Emily?" Patricia blinked. "You don't work here anymore." "I know. Do you know where Mr. Blake is?" Patricia looked at her for a moment. "He didn't come in today." Emily stood on the sidewalk with the cold wind hitting her from the front. "He actually hasn't come in any day this week," Patricia added, with the care of someone delivering information that might matter. "He hasn't been here since Monday." Emily looked at the building entrance for a moment. Then she took her phone out of her pocket and looked up the only address she hadn't used yet. The Blake Holdings office. The Blake Holdings building had 42 floors, a lobby with ceilings high enough to intimidate anyone who walked in without an invitation, and a security guard at the reception desk, with the face of someone who had stopped people more important than Emily Parker from going up without credentials. She went in anyway. "Good evening. I need to speak with Jonathan Blake." The security guard looked at her with the professional patience of someone who does this 200 times a week. "Mr. Blake is not available without an appointment." "I know, but I need to speak with him." "I can take your name, Emily Parker." The security guard started writing, stopped, looked up. "Emily Parker? That's right." He picked up the phone, dialed an extension, waited 2 seconds. "Marcus, there's a Miss Parker here in the lobby. No appointment." A pause. "Yes." Another pause, longer. "Understood." He hung up, looked at her. "Mr. Blake is not in the office this evening. Where is he?" The security guard stood still for a moment with the expression of someone who had received a specific instruction about that specific question. "I can take a contact number and—" "Where is he?" He sighed, the discreet and contained sigh of a professional who knew that direct questions from Emily Parker didn't stop until they had an answer. He picked up a piece of paper, wrote an address, and pushed it across the desk with 2 fingers. Emily looked at the address. She looked at it for a second longer than necessary. It was the neighborhood. The cab took 16 minutes. Emily looked out the window with her hands in her lap and the 5:30 coffee in her mind. Not the coffee itself, but what Dorothy had said about it. The only thing of the day that doesn't depend on anyone. She had spent years building an entire life with that logic. Every decision, every refusal, every boundary drawn with surgical precision. And it had worked. It worked. Only Dorothy had asked a question that hadn't left her head since the night before. "Do you really think you're that fragile?" And the honest answer, the one she had said out loud for the first time in her life, was no. The cab stopped at the corner. Emily got out. The neighborhood at night had the smell of something being cooked on some floor. The yellow light of the old street lamps that the city had promised to replace 2 years ago. And the distant sound of children still awake later than they should be. Emily knew every detail of that by heart. What she didn't know was the scene in front of the community center. 4 people around a folding table on the sidewalk. The neighborhood association representative, 2 community leaders she recognized from meetings, and Jonathan Blake in a dark coat, leaning over an architectural plan spread out on the table. Pen in hand, the same focus she had seen in him in the hallways of the residential building. He wasn't there for her. He was working. "The issue is the side setback here." Jonathan pointed to a section of the plan. "If we keep this boundary, the community space will be too small for what you need. The city won't approve a setback less than 3 meters, said the association representative. The city approves it if the project presents a justification for intensive community use. I've done this in 2 other states before. Jonathan wrote something in the margin of the plan. I need you to bring me the center's attendance data for the last 6 months. With that, the variance request will go through. How long will it take? 3 weeks if the department moves fast. 6 if it doesn't. He looked up from the plan. But it'll go through. Robert was standing outside the closed grocery store with a hot cup of coffee in his hands. Because Robert had the specific gift of appearing at all the important moments in the neighborhood. He turned his head and saw Emily standing on the sidewalk. He lifted his cup toward her in silence. Emily didn't move. Jonathan looked up from the plan at that moment, saw Robert looking at some point behind him. He turned around. He stood still. The 2 community leaders looked at Emily, looked at Jonathan, looked at each other with the discretion of people who recognized a moment when they were in the middle of one. I think we can continue this on Thursday, said one of them, beginning to fold the plan. Thursday works great, agreed the other, already putting the papers away. But we're not done yet, Jonathan said. We're done enough for today. The association representative closed the folder with suspicious efficiency. Good night, Mr. Blake. In 45 seconds, the table was folded, the papers put away, and the 3 of them had disappeared through the community center with the coordinated speed of people who didn't need to arrange anything. Jonathan stood on the sidewalk. Emily stood on the sidewalk. Robert took a sip of coffee and looked to the other side of the street, with the sudden interest of someone who had just discovered something fascinating on the wall of the building across the way. The wind passed between the 2 of them. You went to the office, Jonathan said. It wasn't a question. The security guard gave me the address. I'm going to have a conversation with him about protocols. No, you're not. Emily took 2 steps toward him. He did the right thing. Jonathan stayed quiet. She stopped 2 meters away, looked at the architectural plan still in his hand, half rolled up, looked at the folding table leaning against the wall, looked at the community center with its lit windows and renovated roof and hole-free sidewalk. She looked at him. Are you here because of me? She asked. I'm here because of the side setback on the new project. Jonathan, he lowered the plan. I'm here, he said with the voice of someone choosing every word. Because Dorothy asked me a question I couldn't answer right away. And when I can't answer a question right away, I stay with it until I can. What question? Whether I knew the difference between fixing and being present. Emily looked at him. And do you? I'm learning. A pause. It's taking longer than I'd like. Emily looked at her own sneakers for a moment. The same ones as always, worn out, the right sole still threatening to come off in a threat it never followed through on. Then she looked up. I went to your office, she said, without knowing what I was going to say when I got there. That's unusual for you. It's the first time in my life. She crossed her arms, not as a shield, but like someone still getting their bearings. I spent the whole cab ride trying to figure out what I would say. I couldn't. What happened? I realized that maybe I didn't need to figure out anything. Jonathan stood still, which is different, she continued, from having nothing to say. I have a lot to say. It's just that. She uncrossed her arms, a small gesture, almost involuntary. Some things don't need a speech. The wind moved some leaf in some tree. Emily, Jonathan said, with the care of someone who knows the next sentence matters and doesn't want to ruin it. I didn't come to the neighborhood to get closer to you. I promise that wasn't it. I know. I came because there was real work to do here. Because I finally understood that there was a debt that can't be paid with an anonymous check. I know that too. And because, he paused for a second, being here is the only thing that has made sense since you left the building. Emily looked at him for a long moment, not with the evaluative look he had learned to recognize. Not with the guard raised of someone waiting for the next problem. With a different look. Quieter. The kind of look a person has when they've stopped looking for what might be wrong and started seeing what is there. You know what's funny? She said. What? When you showed up on that street following me, on the first day I thought, this man won't last a week trying to understand this neighborhood. How long did you give me? 3 days, being generous. Jonathan tilted his head slightly. And now? Emily looked at the architectural plan in his hand, at the folding table, at the mural on the wall with the address in the corner, at him. The corner of her mouth rose slowly. Not the millimeter from before, not the contained version he had learned to recognize. A real smile, with time and weight and history behind it. Congratulations, she said, with her voice slightly softer than usual, but with that same thread of steel at the center that had never gone away and never would. You finally learned not to ruin everything. Jonathan felt something in his shoulders that had no name but felt like the physical equivalent of setting down a weight he hadn't known he was carrying. He smiled. Not the meeting smile. Not the negotiation smile. Not the smile of someone building something. The smile of someone who had arrived somewhere and recognized the place when they saw it. It took a while, he said. A long while. But I got here. You did. Robert, across the street, took the last sip of his coffee and began closing up the grocery store. He whistled something softly, the same melody as always, which Jonathan had heard the first time he walked past without knowing he would come back. The community center door opened. Dorothy came out with her cup in her hands, coat buttoned up to her neck, and crossed the sidewalk with the calm pace of someone who is in no hurry to get anywhere. She walked past the two of them without stopping, took a sip of coffee, and kept on walking, as if she already knew exactly how that story would end. Jonathan stood there, in silence. Not because he had nothing to say, but because, for the first time, he understood that not everything needed to be explained. And Emily simply took a deep breath, because sometimes life doesn't change when someone arrives. It changes when you finally see what was always there. Jonathan Blake taught us that control is not power. Power is knowing when not to interfere. Emily showed us that being strong is not pushing the world away. It's continuing to be yourself, even when someone tries to get close. And that, sometimes, the most important changes make no noise at all. If you've ever been afraid of losing who you are because of someone, remember, the right person for your life doesn't erase your essence. They help you protect it. Now tell me, at what moment did this story win you over? Was it in the silence of the hallway, at the community center, or in that instant when it became clear that he was no longer in control of anything? And Emily, did you root for her from the beginning, or was it only when you realized she never needed to be saved? From 0 to 10, what's your score? If this story stayed with you after it ended, if it made you think or feel something hard to explain, then subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, because some stories don't end when we think they do. And knowing Emily, she had probably understood everything long before he realized it.